Dear students, I welcome you to this lecture. In this lecture, I will be talking about perception, the organization principles of perception, and about the factors that influence perception. Every day, different stimuli around us stimulate our sense organs. Many of these stimuli are received by our sense organs and are converted into sensations. These sensations are transmitted to the concerned parts of brain. In turn, the brain interprets these sensations. It is only after such interpretation we understand what the stimuli is. Hence, in understanding the world around us, attention occurs first, followed by sensation, and finally interpretation by brain. This process of interpretation of stimulus is known as perception. So, perception involves two processes, sensation and interpretation. Terming it differently, perception is a subjective, active, and creative process in which we interpret what we sense by assigning meaning to sensory information through which we understand ourselves and others. Much of the behavior of an individual is evoked by stimuli, both internal and external. Stimuli normally evoke responses by stimulating or exciting sense organs. An individual's knowledge of the world around him comes from the impingement of stimuli on his sense organs and the resulting activation of receptors, nerve fibers, and brain cells. Everything an individual does is dependent upon the information encoded in messages from the receptors in his sense organs. But remember, interpretation of any stimulus requires past experience also. For example, a child who has not seen an elephant earlier, either in photo or directly, cannot identify that animal, whereas another child who has seen it earlier will identify the animal easily. Hence, perception may be defined as a process of interpretation of a present stimulus on the basis of past experience. Perception is not as simple as said here. Perception allows us to organize, recognize, and use the information provided by the senses. It is an integrated approach. It is a synthetic process where different physiological and psychological processes are involved. For example, the accuracy of sense organ, clarity of sensations, mental set of an individual, etc. Otherwise, our perception may go wrong. It is important to note here that the major senses that an individual possesses are vision, hearing, smelling, taste, cold, warmth, pain, touch, kinesthesia, and the vestibular sense. Sensation occurs when any of the sense organs, such as the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, or skin, receives a stimulus from the external or internal environment of the individual. Each of these organs is stimulated by a specific and different form of external or internal energy. The eye is stimulated by light energy. Sound energy stimulates the air. Thermal energy stimulates the second senses of warmth and cold, while pressure stimulates the sense of touch and pain. Chemical agents stimulate the nostrils in the nose and the taste buds on the tongue. But as stressed earlier, perceiving is more than sensing. That is why perception is defined as the process by which the sensory input or information is organized and interpreted into a meaningful experience. Whenever the sense organs receive certain stimuli, they are generally processed to make them meaningful. An individual keeps on processing and interpreting the sensory information he receives from his immediate environment. He may interpret a tune as musical, an object as a table or chair, a person as a woman or a man, and so on. Dear students, let us now shift to the principles of perceptual organization. William James, the American psychologist, has said, if we understand the world as it appears to us, it will be a big, blooming, buzzing confusion. Hence, we do not see the things as they appear, but we see them as we want, that is more meaningfully. In perceptual process, we select a particular stimulus with our attention and interpret it. In the same way, whenever it is necessary, many discrete stimuli in our visual field are organized into a form and perceived more meaningfully than they appear. This phenomenon was well explained by Gestalt psychologists. They believed that the brain creates a coherent perceptual experience by perceiving a stimulus as a whole than perceiving discrete entities. This is more meaningfully stated in the Gestalt principle as the whole is better than sum total of its parts. This is explained in many sub-principles of perception. Now, let us look at some of the laws of perception. Law of proximity. The law of proximity states that objects which are close together are likely to be seen as a group. Terming it differently, this law states that stimulus elements that are close together tend to be perceived as belonging together. Students, look at the image. This image is seen as 4 pairs of parallel lines, AB, CD, EF, and GH, instead of 8 vertical lines. Items which are close together in space or time tend to be perceived as belonging together or constituting a group. It is practically impossible to perceive B and C and D and E or F and G as being members of the same perceptual pair. This doesn't only apply to visual perception. Think, for example, of music, perceived as a melody rather than a procession of single notes. Next, it is law of similarity. The principle of nearness doesn't hold for all stimulus constellations. In some situations, other factors operate to override the influence. The law of similarity states that when there are different sets of objects on view, then they are perceived as groups rather than individual objects. This law leads us to link together parts of the visual field that are similar in color, brightness, texture, shape, or any other quality. In the figure displayed, each black square is close to a circle than it is to another black square. Yet the black squares are perceived as being grouped with other black squares instead of the circles which are closer to them. This perceptual phenomenon illustrates the principle of similarity. The greater the similarity among stimuli, the more likely it is that they will be perceived as part of a common group. Now next, it is law of closure. According to the law of closure, things are grouped together if they seem to complete some entity. our brains often ignore contradictory information and fill in gaps in information. According to this law, we prefer complete forms to incomplete forms. Thus, perception of objects is much more complete than the sensory stimulation we receive from them. Perceptual processes tend to organize the world by filling in gaps so that we perceive a whole subject, not disjointed parts. This filling in is called as closure or tendency to complete in perception what is physically an incomplete pattern or object. This principle has been referred to as the pregnance theory in perception, indicating fullness, wholeness, and completeness. The figure shows that viewers tend to supply missing elements to close or complete a familiar figure, even though the figure is actually not there in its totality. When the outline of an object is left unfinished, as long as the gap is less than half the total circumference, then the object is identified and perceived as whole rather than a different shape. Thus, in the figure, we mentally close the gaps and perceive it as IDM. This tendency allows us to perceive whole objects from incomplete and imperfect forms. Now, let us shift to another principle, law of continuity. This is also known as common direction or common fate. The elements of a stimulus having common direction are grouped together and perceived as a separate object from those that have a different direction. This refers to a tendency in which the objects that appear to form a continuous pattern are perceived as belonging together. For example, in the figure, lines AB and CD are perceived crossing each other rather than identified as four lines A, B, C, and D meeting at point B. This is because of the continuity factor. Now, let us see what law of pregnance means. The law of pregnance is sometimes referred to as the law of good figure or the law of simplicity or symmetry. This law holds that objects in the environment are seen in a way that makes them appear as simple as possible. This principle suggests that symmetrical areas tend to be seen as figures against asymmetrical backgrounds. For example, in the figure, there are two arrow-headed lines A and B. Figure A is symmetrical and as such perceived as good figure. It gives an experience of completeness. Figure B is not symmetrical and therefore not experienced as good figure. It gives an experience of incompleteness. The symmetrical figures maintain the balance of set and as such tend to be perceived as good figures as well as organized pattern than those which are not symmetrical. Dear students, let us now focus on some of the factors that affect perception. Human beings are not just mechanical and passive recipients of stimuli from the external world. They are creative beings and try to understand the external world in their own ways. Perception is a subjective, active and creative process in which we interpret what we sense by assigning meaning to sensory information, through which we understand ourselves and others. Thus, our perceptual experiences are not only the matter of varying complexities within the stimulus field, nor these have any neurological basis, but are also a matter of perceiver's personal characteristics. So, besides cultural and environmental influences, human perception is influenced by the perceiver's motivations expectations, values, attitudes, meanings, beliefs, our daily experiences, etc. These play an important role in giving meaning to the external world. It is no wonder we all see the same thing differently. Now let us talk about some of the factors that affect perception. First, effect of learning. Perception is determined by learning. Knowledge of meaning of any stimulus depends upon learning. Every day we learn many new things, events, objects, and situations to form concepts, learn similarities and differences, etc. Learning all these serve as a medium to experience the objects of the world meaningfully. Learning provides perceiving the object's properties. Experiences gained through learning enable us to organize the immediate sensory input into a pattern, a form, and helps us in identifying the similarities among the elements of an object or discriminating them. Learning experiences also enable us to experience the interrelations among the elements, forming an original pattern. Such experiences are essential aspects of our perceptions. Now, let's talk about the needs that interplay a role in perceiving different things. There is no denying the fact that needs and desires of the perceiver strongly influence his or her perceptions. In fact, we perceive what we want to perceive. That is, we tend to focus our attention selectively only on those objects or events of the environment which appear to satisfy our current needs. Other objects or stimuli remain out of focus. Individual differences in motives and needs affect perception. We often attend to or organize sensory inputs in ways that match our needs. For example, people who are hungry, thirsty, or sexually aroused are likely to pay attention to events in the environment which will satisfy these needs. There is no doubt that people find in their environments the things they are looking for, the sort of things which they are motivated to see in the first place. Hunger and thirst motivate persons to see food and food-related objects where there is none. Children have distorted perceptions of candies. This is rarely due to cultural and social factors. Children also overestimate the size of their coins, and there is some evidence that poor children do so more than rich children. Past experience is perhaps an important factor as well as needs and values. Sometimes persons seem not to be clear about what they have perceived, not because they wish to deceive, but because distortions are imposed by their hopes, fears, and other personal inclinations. Each of us sees the world differently and makes it according to one's own choice. This is particularly so in situations involving complex judgments and social evaluation. Need to reduce ambiguity in our perception of the world is a strong motivation. Structured situations are preferred to unstructured ones. This intolerance of ambiguity seems to be related to anxiety. It has been found that anxious persons readily perceive closure in poorly defined objects than non-anxious persons. The anxious persons are more motivated to fill in the gaps in incomplete pictures. Projective tests, such as the well-known Rorschach-Inkblot test, capitalize on the influences of motivation on perception. The inkblots or pictures used in projective tests are ambiguous. They can be perceived in any number of ways. The idea is that people's motives will to some extent affect the ways in which they organize and perceive the test stimuli. Motives are dominant in a particular person. Now, cognitive style. Cognitive style refers to a constant way of dealing with our environment. It significantly affects the way we perceive the environment. There are several cognitive styles that people use in perceiving their environment. One such style that is extensively studied is field-dependent and field-independent cognitive style. Field-dependent people perceive the external world in its totality, that is, in a global or holistic manner. On the other hand, the field-independent people perceive the world by breaking it into smaller units, that is, in an analytical, differentiated manner. Students, sometimes value of an object also makes an impact on one's perception. Value is an important determinant of perception. Every object has a value of its own. However, the value of an object varies from person to person. Some objects may appear valuable to some persons while not valuable to the others. For example, for a rich person, 1 rupee coin may have no value, while the same coin may be highly valuable for a poor person. Now, let us see how physiological factors influence perceptions. Physiological influences come from the physical environment and the ways we are different from each other. We all receive sensory information differently, which can affect personal relationships. Age, or the older we are, allows for greater experience and scope, and the developmental differences shape our perceptions. Health, exhaustion, and hunger also affect our perception and communication. Other physiological factors influence perceptions include biological cycles like menstrual cycles, body temperature, alertness, stress tolerance, etc. Now, let us see how psychological factors influence perception. How we feel at the time or our mood can have a significant effect on how we view people and events. If we are in a positive mood, we are more likely to view other people and our environment positively. But if we are in a negative mood, it may affect things negatively. Although mood may be a temporary condition, our self-concept or the way we see or feel about ourselves has long-term influence on how we perceive and their behaviors. Social influences. Our position in society also shapes our view of society and individual members. Our socio-economic level, family background, and position in the community all will influence our perception of others. Our occupational role, perception of that role by society, and educational background influence how we see things around us. Our gender and relational roles, such as family members and friends, are perceived differently than others. We are also strongly influenced by our culture and its interpretation, organization, and negotiation. Since man is a social being and therefore many of his perceptions are directly or indirectly shaped by his social experience. We tend to perceive an object, person or event in social frame of reference. Dear students, let us conclude here. So far we have understood what perception means, what are the governing principles of perception, and what are the factors that affect perception. I hope you might have enjoyed this lecture. Thanks.